The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent song as Hannah Clarke pushed through the double doors of Mercy General's third-floor unit, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that invisible people accomplish more work. Her scrubs hung loose, intentionally oversized, the kind of camouflage that made her smaller than she actually was. A cup of lukewarm coffee sat in her hands, the same coffee from the break room that had been cooling since 5:30 that morning, bitter now, almost undrinkable, but she drank it anyway because leaving it untouched would draw attention. 15 years. That's how long Hannah Clarke had been walking these corridors in Raleigh, moving between rooms with a steadiness that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school, something darker, something she never discussed. Her left leg moved with barely perceptible stiffness, a cold morning reminder of things that had no official record, no paper trail, no name. She wrapped her other hand around the coffee cup like it was an anchor, kept her head down as she passed the nursing station where Dr. Sterling was reviewing charts with the authority of a man who'd never been told no. The boots were where she'd left them yesterday, behind the industrial cleaning supplies in her locker, their leather cracked from desert sand that wouldn't fully come out no matter how many times she'd tried. They were the only thing she kept from before. Everything else had been erased, the documentation, the deployment records, the photographs, the commendations locked away in a file cabinet at the Pentagon marked classified. But the boots stayed. Tucked into the corner of her locker like some kind of shrine she never admitted to visiting. Some mornings, before her shift started, Hannah would touch the weathered leather and close her eyes, and for approximately 4 seconds she would remember what it felt like to be someone other than a nurse who brought coffee no one had asked for and who volunteered for the shifts no one else wanted. She moved through Mercy General like she moved through the world, shoulders down, eyes forward, speaking only when necessary. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, something human and struggling, that particular hospital smell that never quite washes out of your scrubs no matter how hot you run the washing machine. The ventilator in room 312 wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she passed, steady as a metronome, steady as the hands that had learned steadiness in places that didn't exist on official maps. Hannah had been a nurse here for 15 years because being a nurse was the best way to disappear. Because nurses were invisible. Because no one asked questions about where a nurse's steadiness came from or why her hands never shook during codes or why she could find a subclavian vein in the dark if necessary. Nurses were background. Nurses were safe. The admission came through at 6:47 in the morning, announced by the overhead intercom in that flat, unaffected tone that made everything sound routine. Trauma admit, training accident, possible internal bleeding, patient transported from Fort Liberty with a Navy escort. The name hit the unit board and Hannah froze for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of pause that would have meant nothing to anyone watching, just a moment of hesitation while she refilled the water pitcher in room 301. But those 2 seconds contained 18 years of memory. Captain James Reeves. The name she'd heard whispered in debriefings and classified reports, the 8-year-old boy she'd shielded with her body during a firefight in Kandahar when he was just a child wandering too close to a compound they were clearing, the boy she'd held while rounds hit the mud wall behind her, the boy she'd carried out and never seen again because that was the agreement. That was the price of the erasure. She set the water pitcher down on the medication cart with hands that didn't tremble, hands that had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her pulse was elevated, she could feel it in her neck, that familiar acceleration, the same one she'd felt in Kandahar when the shooting started, but her breathing stayed controlled, in through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. She'd been breathing that way for 18 years, on and off, whenever the past tried to push back through the cracks. The chart came to Dr. Sterling first, of course. Everything came to Dr. Sterling first. He was the kind of attending physician who made sure of that, the kind who stood in the center of any room and expected gravity to bend toward him. Hannah watched from the doorway as he reviewed the trauma notes with that expression of focused attention he wore like a custom suit, the one that said he was thinking several steps ahead of everyone else, even though Hannah could read the actual incompetence underneath it like a subtitle running across his face. Dr. Sterling was in his mid-50s, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, that particular kind of confidence that came from never being questioned by people who had any actual power. He moved through Mercy General like he owned it, which, in some unofficial sense, he did. His family had connections, The kind of connections that showed up in board meetings and country club memberships and phone calls that got answered on the first ring. Hannah had learned to recognize that kind of power years ago, back when she'd learned to recognize the difference between actual authority and the kind that shattered the moment someone with real combat experience walked into the room. But Dr. Sterling had never encountered real combat experience at Mercy General, which meant he'd never learned the difference. Trauma Bay 4, he said to the unit coordinator without looking up from the chart, his voice the kind of smooth that came from knowing no one would question him. "I'll take the case myself. Get me the latest imaging and blood work the moment they arrive. I want this stabilized before the Navy gets too involved." Hannah didn't respond. Responding would mean being noticed. She turned back to her cart and continued distributing water pitchers with the precision of someone performing an invisible task. Behind her, she heard the elevator doors open, heard the controlled urgency of paramedics bringing a stretcher through the corridor, heard the particular sound of medical equipment moving fast, the rattle of wheels, the beep of portable monitors, the sterile specificity of organized crisis. She continued her work, hands moving from room to room, checking vital signs, adjusting fours, existing in that small, controlled space where a nurse with no past could safely remain. By 7:15, Captain James Reeves was lying in Trauma Bay 4, his abdomen distended, his blood pressure already showing the early signs of what blood pressure shows when it's dropping, when the body's losing more than it can replace. Hannah observed from the doorway, her clinical eye-catching details that floated past the rest of the team like debris in water they weren't looking hard enough to see. The way his breathing had the shallow quality of someone compensating for pain, the way his pupils were dilating unevenly, the way his skin had taken on that particular grey-white pallor that meant internal bleeding was happening in real time. She'd seen that color before. She'd seen it in the faces of Marines who'd stepped on something they shouldn't have stepped on, in the faces of men who'd been hit by rounds that went places rounds shouldn't go, in the face of one specific 8-year-old boy who'd wandered into a firefight and came out the other side marked by something that would follow him for the rest of his life. She moved into the room with the other nurses, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she helped stabilize him for imaging, her voice low and steady as she called out vitals to Dr. Sterling, who was already giving orders with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in his entire life. Hannah started an 18-gauge for in his right antecubital fossa, her fingers finding the vein with the kind of certainty that came from having done this 2,000 times in environments where missing meant someone died. The needle went in smooth. The flash came immediate. She secured the line with practiced hands, one strip of tape, then another, her movements economical as surgical instruments. Dr. Sterling glanced at her and looked away again, his expression unchanged, the way someone might glance at a piece of necessary equipment and register nothing worth remembering. "Get him to imaging," Dr. Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions already made. "Full abdominal CT. I want to see the source before we even think about the OR." Hannah stepped back and let him claim the space, let him believe he was running this code the way he believed he was running everything else at Mercy General. She watched as Captain Reeves was wheeled out of the trauma bay, watched his eyes scan the room for something or someone he couldn't quite find, watched the moment when those eyes passed over her face and saw what everyone always saw, a middle-aged nurse in oversized scrubs, forgettable, background, just another person who moved through hospitals without ever actually mattering. She touched the scar tissue on her shoulder through her scrub top, a habit she'd developed to ground herself when the past got too loud. But that wasn't the worst part. What was waiting in the CT scanner? What was about to show up on those imaging results? What was going to happen when Dr. Sterling realized the internal bleeding wasn't stopping, when he realized this wasn't a routine trauma case? That was the worst part. That was the moment everything changed. The internal bleeding hadn't stopped. Sterling could see it in the numbers, the hemoglobin dropping like a stone, the lactate climbing, the base deficit widening. Captain Reeves needed imaging. A CT chest with contrast, a complete vascular survey, within the hour. Sterling knew this. Every physician in Mercy General's trauma unit knew this. But Sterling moved differently now, with the deliberate slowness of a man who had decided something about Hannah Clarke. He ordered the CT. Then he delayed it. A call to radiology. Radiology was backed up, minimum 2 hours. A notation in the chart that Captain Reeves' blood pressure was stable enough for observation. A suggestion to the captain's wife that imaging could wait until morning, that constant testing sometimes caused patient anxiety, that perhaps they should discuss expectations realistically. All of it calculated. All of it wrong. Hannah Clarke saw the trajectory of the numbers and saw the trajectory of Sterling's decisions, and she did what any competent nurse would do at 11:51 p.m. on a Tuesday night at a trauma center. She went to the nurse's station where Dr. Sterling stood reviewing charts, and she spoke to him professionally. "Captain Reeves needs that CT," Hannah said. Her voice was level. The kind of professional level that comes from 18 years of advocating for patients, of reading doctors correctly, of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. His hemoglobin's at 7.2. His lactate is climbing. Internal bleeding doesn't slow down on its own, doctor. Sterling looked up from his chart. His eyes were the color of frozen water. Nurse Clarke. She waited. Professional. Calm. Her hands were still. "I realize," Sterling said, and his voice carried across the nurse's station the way a foghorn carries across open water, that civilian credentials don't include actual medical education. But perhaps you could limit your contributions to bedpans and vitals. The nurse's station went quiet. 2 residents stopped typing. A nurse practitioner suddenly became very interested in her computer screen. Hannah felt the weight of their attention like pressure against her sternum, and she took one measured breath through her nose, the kind of breath taught in combat medicine training, the kind that steadies your hands before you tell someone their child isn't coming home. "Captain Reeves needs a chest CT within the hour," Hannah said. Her eyes didn't leave his. "The clinical picture indicates active hemorrhage. Delay increases mortality risk exponentially." Sterling set down his pen. He stood. He was taller than her by 4 inches, and he used all of them, moving closer until the space between them felt weaponized. His voice dropped, which meant everyone leaned in harder to listen. "Your enthusiasm is admirable, Nurse Clarke. Your competence is not. I've reviewed your credentials. An associate degree from a community college. No postgraduate trauma certification. You've been reading Dr. Google again, I see." He paused. "Perfect timing. The fact that you believe you can contradict my assessment is exactly why I'm glad I make the medical decisions here." Hannah's jaw tightened. She could feel it happen, the muscle along her mandible contracting, a single involuntary response before her training reasserted itself. One tear escaped her left eye before she could stop it. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand while maintaining eye contact, and her voice came out with a devastation so calm it sounded like something breaking inside a locked room. "Destroying me won't make you competent, doctor." She turned and walked away. Her spine was straight. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She moved like someone who had been hurt far worse than words and had decided long ago that words would never be the thing that broke her. The nurse's station watched her go. Sterling watched her go. The silence that followed had weight. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. The break room entered whenever Hannah entered it. She discovered this at 1:15 a.m. when she went to grab coffee during a moment between rounds. 4 nurses were at the table: Morrison, Chen, Valdez, and the new resident, Kowalski. Hannah opened the door. All 4 stood immediately, gathering their containers, their napkins, their phones. Their faces closed off like doors slamming. "Coffee's fresh," Morrison said to no one in particular. Then they filed out past her, and the room smelled suddenly like abandonment and antiseptic. By morning shift, it was systematic. Hannah sat in the break room at 7:36 a.m. with her lunch bag. She was alone for exactly 90 seconds before 2 nurses entered, saw her, and left without getting anything. A resident came in at 8:15, made eye contact, made a visible decision, and walked back out. By noon, Hannah was eating a turkey sandwich that tasted like nothing at all, her hands as steady as they'd always been, her mind calculating that Sterling had moved beyond social isolation and into weaponized institutional pressure, the kind that precedes termination or worse. She touched her left shoulder through her scrub top. Under the fabric, a scar ran from her clavicle down 6 inches, the result of shrapnel in Kandahar 20 years ago. Muscle memory. A reminder that this too had been survived. She finished the sandwich. She threw away the container. She returned to the floor at 1:19 p.m. That's when Sterling posted the write-up. It was on the unit board by 1:44 p.m., printed on official Mercy General letterhead, signed by Sterling and witnessed by the Chief of Nursing. Hannah's name was in bold at the top. Nurse Clarke, disciplinary action pending. Below that, 17 violations highlighted in yellow. Late charting. Failure to follow chain of command. Questioning physician orders without appropriate justification. Overstepping scope of practice. Creating a hostile work environment through insubordination. Each violation was minor individually. Together, they created a narrative. Hannah Clarke was a problem. Staff read it as they passed. Their eyes slid away from her. A junior nurse, Grimes, one of the residents, whispered something to Sterling within Hannah's earshot as he walked past the board. Sterling's reply was loud enough to carry. "Is she really that incompetent?" Grimes asked. "Some people mistake confidence for competence," Sterling said. "We call them Florence." The nickname spread through the unit like contagion. By 3:38 p.m., she heard it twice. By 5:38 p.m., 3 times. Florence, a reference to Florence Nightingale, the reference dripping with contempt, the implication clear, she was a relic. Outdated. Overstepping her station. Hannah stood at the unit board at 6:56 p.m., reading every violation with her face absolutely calm. She didn't tear it down. She didn't argue. She didn't do anything that would give Sterling the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply read it, and her expression remained level as a surgical field. Then she went to the supply closet. The closet was at the end of the hallway, 8 feet by 6 feet, filled with boxes of gloves and gauze and for X for S and all the consumables that kept Mercy General running. The door closed quietly behind Hannah. The fluorescent lights here hummed at a different frequency than the main unit, higher pitched, more insistent. She pressed one palm against the wall between 2 shelves, her skin against institutional beige paint, and she breathed. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The kind of breathing that resets your nervous system. That turns adrenaline into data. That was all this was, data. Information about Sterling's psychological profile. Information about institutional weakness. Information about how many doctors would stand with him and how many might still question his judgment. She had been trained to process threat scenarios, to maintain operational effectiveness under psychological pressure, to not let the enemy, and Sterling was the enemy now, functionally if not formally, see her break. One hand. Steady. Palm flat. Breathing even. No tremor. No panic. No fear. Just the cold processing of a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy who had seen actual combat, who had held a bleeding 8-year-old in her arms while rounds came overhead, who had learned that the human capacity to endure was almost infinite if you trained it correctly. She smoothed her scrubs. She checked her face in the dark glass of a window. Eyes clear. Jaw set. She opened the closet door and stepped back onto the unit floor, and no one would have known that anything had broken inside that locked room, because nothing had. The girl who had screamed in Kandahar was gone. The woman who emerged was made of something harder. Captain Reeves was deteriorating by midnight. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 89%. His neck veins were distending, visible against the side of his neck like cords. His breathing was work now, his lips taking on a dusky quality, the kind that meant insufficient oxygenation. Hannah noticed because that's what senior chief petty officers did, they noticed. She paged Dr. Sterling twice. No response. She called for rapid response activation. Sterling cancelled it remotely, noting in the chart, RN attempting to escalate stable patient due to lack of understanding of normal post-trauma physiology. Hannah documented everything with clinical precision. Exact times. Exact vital signs. Exact clinical findings. Her handwriting didn't shake. Her observations were objective and undeniable. She requested a consult from the senior trauma attending. Sterling blocked it through the chief of medicine before Hannah even finished dialing. By morning rounds, Captain Reeves was struggling. His wife stood at his bedside, her hand on his chest, and their teenage daughter stood in the doorway looking at Hannah with eyes that said, "Help him." Sterling arrived with his entourage, 2 residents, a medical student, an NP who was new enough to still trust what attendings told her. He examined the patient perfunctorily. 3 minutes. Stethoscope to 4 points on the chest. A palpation of the abdomen. A dismissal. CT shows minimal changes, Sterling announced. Likely anxiety-related symptoms. The patient is in pain and catastrophizing. I'm ordering sedation. Hannah stepped forward. Professional. Clinical. Competent. Doctor, his trachea has deviated for centimeters from midline. Breath sounds are absent on the left side. His oxygen saturation is declining despite supplemental oxygen. Sterling turned to her slowly. His eyes were frozen water and ice picks. Florence, when you complete medical school, you can diagnose. Until then, monitor vitals. He ordered sedation. Captain Reeves received 4 milligrams midazolam 4. Then 2 milligrams more. His eyes began to close. His respiratory effort decreased. Hannah stood frozen, calculating oxygen consumption, calculating how long until a completely obstructed airway became a completely stopped heart, calculating the exact moment when she would have to make a choice between following orders and watching a man die. She paged the night shift supervisor. Requested reassignment to another unit. The request was denied before the hour was over. Sterling had called in a favor. The supervisor apologized quietly. You understand how it looks, Hannah. We can't have conflict on the trauma unit, and then Hannah was boxed in completely. No way up the chain of command. No way around Sterling. No way to help Captain Reeves except to help him, which meant crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She visited his room at 2:48 a.m. when the unit was quiet. His wife was asleep in the recliner. His daughter had gone to the cafeteria. Hannah adjusted his pillow, and her hand hovered over his chest where she could feel the displaced air under the skin, where she could feel the beginning of something catastrophic. Is my husband going to be okay? A voice asked from the darkness. Mrs. Reeves. Awake. Desperate. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes before you change everything. I'm doing everything I can. She turned and left the room, and in her mind, she had already made the decision. She had already chosen. And that choice was going to shatter her entire life in exactly 7 hours, when Sterling convened an emergency meeting with the hospital board, when his voice came through the speakerphone in the admin office, calm and clinical and lethal. We have a nurse making diagnostic claims beyond her scope, undermining physician authority. This is a liability we can't afford. I'm recommending immediate termination. He was activating his network. And Hannah Clarke, who had survived Kandahar, who had survived 20 years of erasure, who had survived everything except being truly known, was about to find out that the worst part had only just begun. The monitors told a story Dr. Sterling refused to read. By 4 a.m., Captain Reeves' oxygen saturation had begun its slow descent, 88%, then 86%, then holding at 84% like a hand gripping the edge of a cliff. Hannah noticed it first, always did. Her eyes moved across the screens the way a musician reads a score, each number a note in a composition that was turning discordant. She was checking his dressing when she saw it, the subtle distension of his neck veins, the kind of swelling that spoke a language most nurses missed but that her body recognized from 20 years of muscle memory encoded in places her conscious mind had learned to forget. His trachea. Shifting right. Just barely. Just enough. The training accident had caused internal bleeding, yes, but bleeding didn't shift a trachea. Air did. Pressure did. The kind of pressure that built in a collapsed lung cavity with nowhere to escape. At 4:37 a.m., Hannah paged Dr. Sterling. Her voice was steady, clinical, the practiced tone of a nurse who had learned to couch urgency in the acceptable language of deference. Captain's oxygen saturation trending down. 84% on supplemental O2. Neck veins distended. Trachea deviated right. Recommend reassessment. No response. At 5:12 a.m., she paged again. Saturation now 79%. Patient becoming anxious. Recommend urgent imaging or clinical evaluation. The silence from Dr. Sterling was its own kind of answer. A calculated silence. A deliberate absence. And through that absence, Hannah felt something shift inside her, something that had been dormant for 2 decades, sleeping in the place between her ribs where she kept all the things she couldn't say. Her hands moved on their own, checking supplies. Her eyes catalogued equipment locations. Her mind, unbidden, began running calculations that belonged to a person she had buried: respiratory rate changes, intercostal space anatomy, the precise angle of the needle that would penetrate the chest wall between the second and third ribs at the midclavicular line, that single motion that would let the trapped air escape like a prisoner finally released. No. She pushed it down. She was a civilian nurse. She followed protocols. She waited for doctors who didn't answer pages. By 6:41 p.m., Captain Reeves was breathing like he was running a marathon while lying perfectly still. His chest rose and fell with the desperate effort of someone pulling air through a closing door. 40 respirations per minute. 40. A normal human should move air 12 to 20 times. The fact that his body was fighting this hard meant it was losing. Hannah could see it in the color draining from his face, the pale gray creeping in like a tide. She thought of an 8-year-old boy in Kandahar, dust in his hair, blood on his shirt, and how she had promised him then, standing between him and the bullets, that she would never let him down. At 6:13 p.m., during the shift change when the ward filled with the shuffle and chatter of incoming evening staff, Captain Reeves' body made its final decision for him. His back arched. His chest went rigid as stone. His respirations came in rapid, shallow gasps, the breathing of someone drowning in air. His oxygen saturation alarm screamed, 73% and falling. 68. 65. The numbers dropping like a countdown to something final. Hannah hit the code button. She was already moving, grabbing the 14-gauge angiocath needle, her fingers finding it like muscle memory returning to muscle, like a piece of her DNA recognizing itself. The needle decompression kit. The alcohol wipe. Everything she would need. Everything she had been trained to use in a place where there were no doctors, where the only thing between you and death was your hands and your will. The unit exploded into motion. Code blue, the overhead announcement cut through Mercy General like a siren. Doctors converged from every direction: cardiology, internal medicine, surgery. The hospitalist checking her messages became a sprinting version of herself. The break room emptied. The charts were abandoned. 20 doctors. Hannah counted them as they came through the door, their faces showing that particular blend of adrenaline and obligation that came with codes. 20 pairs of eyes turning toward the patient, toward the monitor, toward the moment where they would all become either lifelines or witnesses. Dr. Sterling was last. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. He examined Captain Reeves for 40 seconds, eyes on the monitor, ears listening to the silent chest, hands checking nothing. Then he stepped back from the bedside. His voice, when it came, was administrative. Calm. The voice of someone reading from a script he had already prepared. Tension pneumothorax, Hannah said. Her voice cut through the ambient chaos of a code, the beeping, the movement, the barely controlled urgency. Needs immediate needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Sterling turned to face her. His expression didn't change. This case has significant liability exposure. The patient is military. Any adverse outcome triggers federal review. Automatic investigation. I'm declaring this too high risk for this facility. A cardiologist stepped forward. Young. Earnest. What's the plan, Dr. Sterling? We document the inherited complication from inadequate nursing assessment. We stabilize for transfer. Duke Medical Center is 20 minutes out. We transfer and let them assume the risk. Captain Reeves' oxygen saturation was now 60%. His wife was at the window, her hand pressed against the glass. His daughter was screaming, a sound like a siren that nobody was answering. Hannah's voice came again, quieter this time but reaching every person in the room. He'll be dead in 10 minutes. Sterling turned to her. And in his eyes, she saw something that was worse than anger. She saw satisfaction. She saw a man watching his plan work exactly as intended. Then perhaps you should have followed protocol, Florence. Perhaps if you had better understood the complex variables at play here, we wouldn't be in this position. He looked at the 20 doctors assembled around the bed. Anyone who touches this patient assumes full personal liability. I'm documenting this as inherited complication from inadequate nursing assessment. Department of Defense will be notified. Your licenses will be flagged. An intern opened his mouth. Sterling silenced him with a look so sharp it cut off words before they formed. One by one, they stepped back. The cardiologist who had moved forward shook her head and walked toward the door. The surgeon checked her phone like it held better options. The hospitalist's face flushed, shame and fear crossing her features in quick succession before she turned away. The intensivist, the nephrologist, the resident, the attending from surgery, all of them moving backward, creating space, creating distance, creating the appearance of deference to authority even as a patient died 15 feet away. Hannah counted them, leaving like she was counting shots fired. 5. 10. 15. 20. All of them. Every single doctor in the room except Sterling himself, who pulled the door closed behind him as he exited, his phone already rising to his ear before his feet hit the hallway. Through the window, she watched him cross the parking lot. His mouth was moving. His free hand gestured as he walked. He was already making calls. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head, the absolute confidence of a man who had just eliminated his last remaining threat. Inside the room, silence crashed down like a ceiling collapsing. Captain Reeves' wife was crying silently now, her hand still pressed to the glass. His daughter had stopped screaming, which was somehow worse. The monitors continued their algorithmic panic, beeping and alarming and announcing a deterioration that nobody was allowed to address. Hannah stood alone at the bedside. Her hands opened and closed. Her jaw clenched tight enough to feel the muscle cord in her neck. Oxygen saturation 58%. Her eyes moved across the kit in front of her, the needle, the alcohol wipe, the exact supply she would need to do something that would end her career, destroy her carefully constructed civilian life, and violate every protocol that Dr. Sterling had so carefully enshrined. She thought of Kandahar. Of dust and blood and a child with eyes too old for his face. Of the promise she had made while lying across his body, shielding him from bullets with the only armor she had, her own frame, her own will, her own absolute refusal to accept that this child would die on her watch. She reached for the needle decompression kit. Her hands didn't shake. The alcohol wipe came out first. She prepped the skin at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where pressure had gathered like a prisoner behind a locked door. She could feel her muscle memory taking over, the knowledge that had never really left even though she had tried for 20 years to bury it under fluorescent lights and shift work and the careful anonymity of civilian nursing. Through the window, Dr. Sterling's phone call continued in the parking lot. His words inaudible but his intent clear. He was calling board members. Investigators. Building the case against her even as she was about to save a life. Captain Reeves' oxygen saturation fell below 55%. Hannah's voice came out barely above a whisper, directed at the monitor, at the patient, at the promise she had made 2 decades ago to a child who was now a man and running out of seconds. "I've got you, Captain." She brought the needle forward. The needle slid forward. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line on the left, the exact anatomical landmark Hannah's hands had found 1,000 times in field medicine 20 years ago in Kandahar, muscle memory overriding 2 decades of civilian work. Her movements were fluid, practiced, the kind of precision that only came from trauma training under fire. The angle was 17 degrees. The depth was 2 centimeters. Her hands didn't shake. They never had. She felt the pleura give way, that subtle resistance that told her everything was correct. Then came the sound that changed everything. The hiss. That catastrophic whisper of air rushing out of Captain Reeves' chest cavity like a tire rupturing at highway speed, the tension pneumothorax releasing its stranglehold on his lung and heart. The sound of pressure equalizing. The sound of a man getting his oxygen back. Reeves gasped. His body convulsed once, then his breathing eased. The monitor beeped its rhythm, still elevated, still urgent, but no longer the flat, frantic desperation of minutes before. Hannah watched the oxygen saturation numbers climb on the monitor. 74. 80. 85. 92. His systolic pressure stabilized. His wife, who had been standing frozen in the corner, collapsed into a chair behind them, her hand covering her mouth, shoulders shaking with the kind of relief that comes only after believing you've lost everything. Hannah documented every detail. Timestamp. Vital signs before. Vital signs after. The exact location of the needle placement. The rush of air. The response. She wrote in black ink, her handwriting steady, clinical, precise, the documentation of a procedure she had no legal authority to perform. A procedure that would cost her career before the shift ended. She knew that. She had always known that. The moment she'd pushed the needle forward, she'd accepted the price. She reached for her phone. Paged the supervisor. Her voice was calm, measured, each word weighted with purpose, patient stabilized. Tension pneumothorax decompressed. I performed needle decompression at second intercostal, mid-clavicular. Outside nursing scope. Reporting myself immediately. The response came back, stay in the room. 40 minutes. That's how long Hannah had before Dr. Sterling's call started working. He had spent the time in the parking lot, and not at Reeves' bedside where a patient had just been pulled back from the edge of death, but in his car, making calls that felt, to him, far more strategic. 3 board members first, his voice low and urgent, we have a patient safety crisis. Unlicensed procedure. Nursing overreach. I need documentation started. The State Nursing Board received a call at 5:02 p.m., a concerned physician reporting serious gaps in clinical judgment from a particular RN. 2 former colleagues, one in Chicago, one in Seattle, received detailed messages with fabricated concerns about Hannah's competence, her education, her pattern of insubordination. He hired an outside investigator with his personal credit card, already plotting the trajectory. By 6:10 p.m., the chief of medicine was walking into Trauma Bay 3, followed by hospital security. Sterling was beside them, his face arranged in an expression of grave concern. He didn't look at Reeves. He didn't ask about the patient. His eyes went directly to Hannah. The chief of medicine held a tablet. His voice was formal, the kind of tone used to deliver news that cannot be undone. Nurse Clarke, we have serious concerns about your conduct. You performed a medical procedure outside your scope of practice. The Board of Nursing has been notified. We're terminating your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker. Hannah nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She had chosen this the moment she saw Reeves' oxygen saturation at 64 and watched 20 doctors, every single physician in that room, including Sterling himself, stand up and walk away. 20. The entire evening medical staff. She had counted them as they left. Security handed her a cardboard box. It was the same size as the one they'd given the last nurse fired under Sterling's watch, 3 years earlier. She walked to her locker in the break room. The silence as she entered was the kind of silence that happens when people are ashamed of what they've witnessed. Nurses averted their eyes. An intern suddenly became very interested in his phone. Hannah packed her things methodically. Her stethoscope. Her badge. The small framed photo of her son at his middle school graduation. The trauma shears she'd carried for 15 years. Last, she wrapped her pair of worn combat boots, the ones from Kandahar, with the scuffed leather and the sand still in the laces that had never quite come out, in a grocery bag and placed them in the cardboard box. She walked out through the ER at 9:44 p.m., still wearing her scrubs, past nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes. Past the waiting room where a mother was holding a feverish toddler. Past the ambulance bay where the night shift paramedics were rolling in another trauma. The world kept moving. The hospital kept working. As if she had never been there at all. She drove home in silence. No radio. No podcasts. Just the sound of the windshield wipers against rain that had started somewhere between the parking lot and Route 40, hammer loud against the glass, relentless. She parked in her driveway at 10:15 p.m. and sat in the car for 18 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The kitchen table was where she sat when her son came home from school the next afternoon. She was still in her scrubs, she'd been wearing them for nearly 18 hours. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The cardboard box was by the door. Her son dropped his backpack, looked at her face, and something in his chest shifted. He'd never seen his mother cry before. Not when his father left. Not when his grandmother died. Not when anything. She was the person who fixed things. The person who stayed calm. The person who held everything together. Mom? Why are you home? She couldn't answer. Her voice was gone. Her hand covered her mouth, and tears ran down her face in a way that terrified him because it meant something was fundamentally wrong with the world. She couldn't tell him about Kandahar. Couldn't tell him about classified records and erased identities and the promise she'd made 20 years ago to disappear and never surface. Couldn't tell him that saving a man's life had just cost her everything. Mom, what happened? His voice cracked on the last word. She shook her head. He stood there for a moment, then climbed the stairs to his room. She heard him moving things around for a while. Then silence. Then footsteps coming back down, heavier now, slower, deliberate. He was carrying something. A showbox. He was carrying something. A showbox. Hannah's breath caught as her son stepped into the kitchen, his face pale, the box trembling slightly in his 14-year-old hands. She couldn't speak. Couldn't ask. The scrubs she still wore, the same scrubs from her shift, from the moment security had walked her out, felt like they didn't belong to her anymore. Nothing belonged to her anymore. Her son sat across from her at the kitchen table, the showbox between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Mom, he said, his voice cracking the way it had when he was small. They need to see these. He opened the box. Her medals lay inside on faded velvet, each one catching the afternoon light that poured through the kitchen window. Bronze star. Silver star. 2 purple hearts with their ribbon edges worn from being carried in gear bags across 3 continents. Her hands moved toward them, then stopped. She couldn't touch them. Couldn't let her son see her hands shake, because they would shake if she touched them, because those medals represented a Hannah Clarke that was supposed to stay buried, classified, erased into the civilian life she'd been ordered to disappear into 20 years ago. Where did you find those? Her voice was steady. She trained it to be steady. The attic. In your old duffel bag, under the insulation. He lifted one medal carefully, reading the citation attached to its ribbon. His voice broke on Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. Mom, what is this? What are these? The kitchen seemed to compress around her. 24 hours ago, she'd been performing a medical procedure she was trained to perform, saving a life that had already intersected with hers in ways he would never understand. And in saving him, she destroyed herself. Dr. Sterling had made sure of it. He hadn't simply filed a complaint. He'd orchestrated something far more calculated, more comprehensive, more devastatingly competent than public humiliation alone. After she'd been escorted from the building, while she sat in her car in the parking lot unable to turn the ignition, Sterling had been making calls. She learned this later, learned it from the letter the state nursing board had sent to her apartment 3 days ago. That letter detailed 17 separate violations that Sterling and his network had manufactured. 17 violations that didn't exist, compiled by colleagues he'd brought in specifically to discredit her, to make sure no hospital in North Carolina would ever hire her again. The first call had gone to Dr. Marcus Webb, a cardiologist Sterling had trained with at Duke. Webb owed Sterling a favor, a quiet favor from a malpractice case Sterling had testified in 5 years prior, a case that had disappeared from the civil docket. In exchange, Webb had agreed to contact the state board with a formal statement questioning Hannah's clinical judgment, her training, her fundamental understanding of scope of practice for registered nurses. Webb's statement was dated the morning after she'd been fired. It had been submitted before she'd even received her termination letter. The second call had gone to a licensing board investigator named Patricia Hawthorne, a woman who'd had dinner with Sterling's wife at a gala 6 months prior. Hawthorne had opened a file on Hannah Clarke marked Pattern of Unsafe Practice. The file contained nothing, no incident reports, no patient complaints, no documented harm. It contained only Sterling's carefully crafted narrative, backed by Webb's statement, suggesting that a nurse with inadequate medical education had repeatedly overstepped her role, made judgment calls beyond her training, and endangered patients through her arrogance and recklessness. The third call had gone to the hospital's board of directors. Sterling had prepared a presentation, a detailed slide deck documenting his concerns about Hannah's competence, her pattern of insubordination, her concerning tendency to question physician decisions. The presentation didn't mention that she'd saved a patient's life. It didn't mention that 20 doctors had walked away and she'd acted. It simply presented a false narrative, backed by fabricated documentation, designed to ensure that her termination would be absolute and irreversible. By the time Hannah's son had found her at the kitchen table that afternoon, 3 days after the needle decompression, Sterling's network had already begun fragmenting her civilian identity. Her employment file at Mercy General contained 17 citations for violations she hadn't committed. Her state licensing board file contained an open investigation into her clinical judgment. Her professional references were being systematically discredited by colleagues Sterling had contacted. Dr. Sterling had understood something fundamental about institutional destruction. It wasn't enough to humiliate someone. You had to dismantle their ability to survive the humiliation. You had to make them unemployable, untrustworthy, radioactive. You had to ensure that even if the truth emerged, it would be buried under so much procedural noise that it wouldn't matter. He'd learned this lesson well. He'd executed it with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning how to weaponize bureaucracy. And he'd almost succeeded. "Tell me," her son said, his voice stronger now, a 14-year-old boy looking at his mother and understanding, for the first time, that she was not what she'd appeared to be. "Tell me what these mean." Hannah looked at her hands, the hands that had held her son when he was born, the hands that had changed his diapers and helped him with his homework and packed his lunch every day of his life. The hands that had also held dying soldiers in Kandahar, had applied tourniquets in the dark, had performed field surgery in the back of Hums. The hands that, 3 days ago, had performed a needle decompression that saved a man's life. The hands now marked as unemployable. 12 years, Hannah said quietly. 3 tours. That's what the medals represent. But you're a nurse. You've been a nurse my whole life. I was a lot of things before I was a nurse. She stood, moved to the window, pressed her palm against the glass. Outside, rain had begun to fall on their neighborhood in Raleigh. The drops seemed to accumulate on the pane with purpose, with weight. I was a medic. A senior chief petty officer in the Navy. I served in Kandahar. That's in Afghanistan. I received these medals for things I'm not permitted to discuss. Her son didn't speak. She could hear him breathing behind her, could feel the weight of his confusion and shock pressing against her back. Why did you hide them? He asked. Because I was ordered to hide them. Because I was told that if I ever surfaced, if I ever let anyone know who I actually was, I would compromise classified operations, endanger people, violate my security clearance. She turned to face him. Because I made a choice 20 years ago to disappear. To become Hannah Clarke, the civilian nurse, instead of Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke. And I've kept that choice for 14 years with you, and I would make it again, because it kept you safe. She sat back down at the table, reached out and touched the Navy Cross, the highest medal, reserved for extraordinary heroism in combat. She'd received this medal for something that happened in Kandahar that she would never, could never, speak about. That patient I saved yesterday, she said. The Navy officer. I knew him when he was 8 years old. Her son stared at her. During my second tour, there was a firefight near a residential compound. A child was caught in the crossfire. I shielded him with my body. The medals aren't important. What's important is that I made a choice to protect him, and I'd make the same choice again. And 3 days ago, when he came through the emergency department bleeding internally, I made the same choice again. I saved his life using training I was never supposed to use as a civilian nurse. And they fired you for it, her son said. It wasn't a question. They're trying to destroy me for it, Hannah corrected. Dr. Sterling, the doctor in charge, didn't like that I questioned his decisions. Didn't like that I was right about the patient's condition. And when I saved that patient's life, he saw an opportunity. He's contacted the state board. He's fabricated violations. He's told lies to other doctors to make sure my references are worthless. He's trying to make me unemployable. What are you going to do? Her son's voice was small. Hannah looked at her hands again. These hands had held lives together. These hands had been steady through every code, every emergency, every moment when someone else was falling apart. These hands had earned the respect of commanding officers and enlisted personnel and, for 15 years, every nurse and doctor she'd worked alongside, until Dr. Sterling had decided that her competence was a threat to his ego. I don't know yet, she said finally. I can't fight back without revealing everything. And if I reveal everything, my security clearance gets reviewed, the classified operations get reviewed, people who served with me could be affected. I gave my word 20 years ago. I signed documents. I made an oath. So you just let him win. Anger flashed in her son's voice, 14-year-old fury at injustice. Hannah reached across the table and took her son's hand. Squeezed it once. No, she said. But I need to understand what my options are before I make my next move. Because once I surface, once I tell the truth about who I am, there's no going back. The classified past stays classified, but my identity doesn't. People will know. The Navy will know. The entire hospital will know. And then I have to live with the consequences of that knowledge. She looked at the show box. At the medals her son had found. At the tangible evidence of a life she'd been ordered to bury. For now, she said, we keep these. We keep them safe. And we wait to see what happens next. Because something is coming. Something that will force the truth out into the open whether I'm ready or not. She didn't know how right she was. Within the next 48 hours, the hospital board would begin receiving calls from a number they didn't recognize. A number with a 703 area code, Northern Virginia. The calls would be from Commander James Richards, attached to a unit that didn't officially exist, wanting to discuss a patient who'd been admitted to their emergency department. The board would initially think it was a courtesy call. They would learn very quickly that it was not. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Hannah sat at her kitchen table with her son, watching rain fall on Raleigh, and made her choice. She picked up the Navy Cross. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, its reality, its truth. She looked at her son. I kept these hidden because I thought I could live 2 lives. The soldier I was and the nurse I became. But those lives are about to collide. She set the medal down carefully. And when they do, I need you to understand something. When people ask you about your mother, when they look at you differently once they know what she actually is, that none of that changes who I am to you. It just explains some things about me that have always been there. Her son wiped his eyes. Nodded. Are you scared? He asked. Terrified, Hannah said. But I've learned that sometimes you don't get to choose whether to be brave. You only get to choose whether to be honest about being scared. And I'm choosing honesty now. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering the windows like applause, like a countdown, like the sound of a door finally opening that had been locked for 20 years. Hannah Clarke stared at her hands one more time. These hands that had saved a life. These hands that had been trained to kill and trained to heal and trained to survive. These hands that belonged to a woman who was about to stop hiding. And she let the truth begin to surface, no matter the cost. Subscribe to see what happens when the Navy arrives at Mercy General and discover why one hospital board made the decision that changed everything. Like this video if you'd be willing to put your entire career on the line to save someone's life. And in the comments below, tell me, would you have revealed your secret, or would you have stayed hidden?